باب المدينة وحامي نبينا، باب المدينة وحامي نبينا.
علي 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 علي
علي منهج، علي تلهج باسمك املاك السماء، علي صولة وعلي جولة، علي بتار ودماء، علي سجدة على خده للعلي دمعة همة، علي غيرة وعلي غيرة من كفول فاطمة.
About the big research institutions, they know about state schools, they know about community colleges. Liberal arts colleges tend to be small. The emphasis of liberal arts colleges is not on teaching graduate students, but rather on teaching undergraduates. They tend to be hard to get into, competitive, and tend to accept students with proven skills in writing and reading, and students who have had high grades in high school. Students at liberal arts colleges aren't competing with grad students for the time of their professors, and thus they tend to be worked very hard. And so one of the reasons I've come here is to suggest that those of you who are looking at where to go to school and where to continue your education, or if you have children who are thinking about this, to consider the liberal arts as one of those places where you can go to really get an intensive education. And I have some Kenyan literature here if anybody's interested in looking at that in any form. The other thing about liberal arts colleges, and that's what this talk today is about, is they are tied to the tradition of the liberal arts that is an education that emphasizes the humanities. That is to say, at liberal arts colleges, we are less concerned with vocational preparation than with the development of skills for lifelong learning. Students at liberal arts colleges tend to read more in their courses. A lot of times, people, my friends who teach at state schools, are amazed at just how much reading and writing we require in our seminars. Often our advanced seminars are very much more like graduate level courses. We get a lot of second generation college students whose parents went to really good state schools and became professionals themselves and are now interested in providing for their children this more intimate, more directed kind of education. And what's at the core of that is that it's a humanistic education. It's not in the sense of materialism in terms of humanism, but in the terms of focused on asking questions about what it means to be a human being. Now, let me say right from the beginning that there are two basic approaches to this notion of the liberal arts. One I agree with and one that I don't. The first one, the one that I disagree with, is sadly Eurocentric and conservative, believing that all the great ideas of humanity are to be found primarily in the great books of quote-unquote Western civilization. The view of these folks, and there's still quite a few of them around in the academy, is one that divides the world up between us and them. Those who hold to this perspective believe that students should read the great books and discuss them to seek out their timeless values and see those values to be found primarily in a Western mirror. People like me, who are hired to teach courses connected to Islam or South Asia, were often thought of as adding spice to the main course of an education, the main course of Shakespeare or Goethe or John Stuart Mill or Einstein. It might be nice to know who Ibn Arabi or Al-Farabi were, but it certainly was not thought of as essential knowledge. More importantly, the kids who traditionally went to liberal arts colleges tended to be, and I'll be just really honest here, rich, white, and for the first half of the century, male. And even in Kenya, for the first part of my career, my classes on Islam often had not a single Muslim in them. Now that's very weird. To be teaching a course on Islam, and there's not a single person who identifies as a Muslim in the class except me. And so, you know, let's learn about these strange, extraordinary people called Muslims. The only thing worse is when you have one Muslim in the class. Then everyone looks to see, is the professor saying the right thing? I'll check with them. Because this notion that there are lots of different ways in which people express their Islam can only really be understood when you have multiple Muslims in the classroom. This was once the dominant situation of liberal arts colleges, that people like me who taught about Islam were hired to teach white kids about brown people, to put it bluntly. But thankfully, over the last decades, this has been eroded by a newer and more truly humanistic worldview, one that understands the world as interconnected and sees the entire scope of human history as part of a global shared heritage. I came to Kenyon as part of a generation of scholars who wrote our dissertations in the wake of Edward Said's monumental Orientalism. Around the time I was hired, our college, like many others, began to hire scholars explicitly because we taught and learned about things outside of Europe and North America. So we hired people to teach Chinese and Japanese. We taught people who were historians of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And over time, and not without controversy, it became part of the normal understanding of the humanities, not just at Kenyon, but across the country, that an educated person in the 21st century needed to really have a global education. Yes, you needed to know about Plato and Aristotle, but you also should know something about Confucius and Mencius, and about the Bhagavad Gita and the Guru Granth Sahib, and Abdul Qadir Jilani and Muinuddin Chishti. Simultaneously, over time, Kenyon's student body has begun to grow ever so slowly to become more diverse. And a subtle shift began to appear with a new goal, that there should be no other in the classroom. Why do we have to keep talking about East and West, us and them? Isn't there a way in which simply learning about people is learning about people? As time went by, important changes occurred. For example, the history department for the first time hired a historian of the Islamic world. Now imagine that in the first 20 years that I was at Kenyon, we had nobody who taught the history of the Islamic world. And there are lots of colleges in the United States where there is nobody who teaches the history of the Islamic world. The good news is that once you do that, you suddenly go, how did we go for decades without having anybody who taught this? We got a new provost a few years back, and he supported new positions. After a decade of Arabic being taught only as an adjunct or part-time position, we finally tenure-tracked the Arabic position. Not surprisingly, once we began, therefore, to actually advertise that we taught Islamic civilization and cultures, we began to get students from a Muslim background. Palestinians, Bengalis, Arab Americans, students from Morocco and Indonesia. Religiously, our students who are Muslim run the gamut. We have Sunnis and Shias, people who identify as secular Muslims, hijabis and non-hijabis, those interested in the Sufi tradition. But the difference is that now when I teach my Islam courses, I almost always have 2 or 3 Muslims in the room, and that changes everything. That changes everything that happens. And we now have a new organization on campus that the students put together called the Middle East Students Association, which not only has Muslim students, but also Jewish students and secular students interested in understanding and coming together to understand these parts of the world, and it's been really remarkable. For the first time, we're having really open and honest discussions, for example, about the Palestinian crisis, but also about Syria, and also about Iran, in ways that are not reduced to the kind of mind-numbing nonsense one sees on CNN. We got a Title VI grant recently to be able to integrate these things, and for the last 3 years we brought in an array of speakers. Said Hussein Nasser, Scott Kugel, Fatima Keshavarz, the Lian Ensemble, whole range of people. And I would like to say, I think I can say quite honestly, that for the first time, I'm assured that I think Kenyon has decided that we've integrated Islam as part of what is essential for somebody who wants to be educated in this century needs to know. Now, having said all that, since this is an Ali conference, and you may wonder, what does this have to do with Hashrat Ali? I want to explain what that connection is. As somebody whose career involves trying to teach a diverse group of people what I can about Islam at the undergraduate level, it's very clear to me that to understand Islam in the context of the liberal arts, that Hazrat Ali provides a touchstone that is completely invaluable. First off, why do students at a liberal arts college take courses on Islam? Most of my students are still Anglos, students who have no real connection to the Islamic world except an interest. We are now getting more what are called in the jargon of the academy heritage students. But that means that I find myself facing a classroom where students come for a variety of reasons, but what I find is really fascinating as a Kenyon is that people at Kenyon who take Arabic, they don't take Arabic because they want to learn to listen to the chatter of terrorists, because they're, that it's somehow something we do for national security reasons. They want to learn Arabic because they want to read Arabic literature, because they think there is something valuable that Arabic speakers have to teach them about what it is to be a human being. They want to study the Islamic world because they think that there are things to be learned from people who are Muslim that they can learn as human beings. Therefore, when I try to figure out how I'm going to teach about Islam, I begin with the notion that there is something both for Muslims and non-Muslims to learn that transcends simple, the kind of learning that is specific to one tradition alone. Now I'm going to say something that's very provocative here. I think we make a mistake if we see Islam as primarily a legal religion. Yes, Sharia is a part of Islam, and a very important part of Islam, but it is not its core. Sharia is furu'. It is not usul. Let me give you two examples that I think show how Muslims wrestle with this. When I first was in Pakistan studying about Muharram and about Imam Hussein, about Imam Ali, I was asked many times, are you Muslim? And once I was asked at a julus, are you Muslim? And I said, I love the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I love God. But I haven't submitted to Islam, and I don't pray, and I don't fast, and I don't know if I have the discipline to pray and fast. And the person looked at me and said, Vernon G, the people who killed Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they said all 5 prayers the day they were. Now, the other side of that, however, is the next day at a julus, I'm watching people at the julus, and the person says, I never miss my prayers. And they said, why? Because the imams prayed, and the Ahl Bayt prayed, and I do this because I love them. And so, the notion that we have here is the idea of moving past the notion that Islam is just about rules. It's not only about rules, it's not primarily about rules. In fact, what I'm going to argue is that Islam, and particularly Islam as we see it as presented in the marvelous personages of Hazrat Imam Hussein, is about 2 things. It's about love, ishq, muhabbat, and it's about insan, humanity. And when I teach about these things in my classes, I begin here because the one thing that I find, if I have Sunni kids in class, and I have Shia kids in class, and I have secular kids in class, is that when they focus on the life of Muhammad and of Ali and of the people who were involved in that first generation, they see something much more profound than simply a list of rules. They come to see something that they learn not only about how people in a particular religion think, but something about what it is to be a human being. So let me begin by talking about humanity in Islam, because I think that's lost. I mean, some people would find it insulting to say Islam is a humanistic religion, but I think we have to see it as such. After all, the Quran, when it addresses its audience, says Ya Insan much more than it says Ya believers or Ya Muslims. It speaks to human beings. And one of the things I find most fascinating about the Quran is that the Quran tells the story of the creation of Adam 7 separate times. Because, as Fazl Rahman, the late professor at the University of Chicago, put it, there's no point of religion without human beings. You don't need religion except for human beings. When the Quran tells that wonderful poetic story about offering the world as an amanat, trees and mountains automatically do Islam. They automatically submit. So do lions and tigers and bears. Only human beings can commit zulm upon themselves by saying, I accept free will. I choose to have this special relationship with the creator of the universe. For me, the genius of Islam, we're coming back to this notion of usul, is that the 2 primary mysteries of the usul, Tawheed, the unity of God, and the Qiyamah, are communicated to people by people, to humanity by humanity. Nubuwwat, which is shared by all Muslims, is evidence of the importance of the human being as the giver of revelation to human beings. And imamat, which in the Shia tradition completes that, points to the importance of the human being as the teacher of humanity, of what it is to be a human being. And in that we see that final usul of justice. There is no way to separate out human beings from the notion of revelation. Given the importance of humanity in this process, I believe it is crucial, and I do this in my classes, to stress the narratives of the early Muslims, especially the Prophet Muhammad. Because if we want to understand Islam, we need to look at what the Prophet did. Not just how he shaved his beard or how long he wore his pajamas, but how he dealt with people, how he dealt with his friends, how he dealt with the people he loved, how he dealt with his enemies. And one cannot fully discuss the biography of the Prophet without discussing Hazrat Ali. Central to this discussion, therefore, since this is about it, I would like to do is to talk a little bit about how I talk about Hazrat Ali in my classes. For me, the mystery of human relationships are caught and manifested in the mystery of the relationships between God and humanity as they are expressed in the relationships between God and the Prophet and God and Ali. Hazrat Ali, as we all know, has many names. He's Amir al-Mu'mineen. He's Mawla Ali. It says there that, that means master, but it also means servant, and it also means friend. In many languages, Ali simply becomes dost, the friend. One of my favorite, I was at a shrine in Pakistan, it was simply, Shah. We can talk all we want about how Ali is seen by Muslims as the fourth caliph, and therefore he's the fourth in excellence, but I have never been anywhere in the world, and this is how it works when I really talk about it in my classes, is that students remember things they heard from their parents. Ali is special, not just for the Shia, but throughout the Islamic world. All of Ali's names have to do with his question of his relationships, both his relationships to God and to the Prophet and to the rest of humanity. I believe if we begin our study of Islam with the biography of the Prophet and his relationships, we discover that Islam, therefore, we start with this notion of humanity, of looking at the Prophet and Ali as exceptional human beings, but it is also essentially about love. Now, I think this is important, and I say this in my classes, and I don't mean to be flip, but when we watch rom-coms, we watch romantic comedies, at the beginning of the rom-com, if you're being all rational about it and thinking, well, is he the right one? Make a list. He's good or bad. That's not the person going to wind up with. Then in the end, that what the mystery of human relationships are rooted in something more profound. It's this experiential experience of love. And how is the mystery of love between God and Muhammad and humanity most fully expressed? Well, in the first place, and this is again something that's shared by both Sunni and Shia, because it's in Hadith in Sahih Muslim, that what's the first thing God created? The light of Muhammad. So why did God create the universe? To have a place for his beloved to be manifest. Now, whether or not that's poetry or whether or not that's fact, it really doesn't matter, because the point of that is it says something so crucial about the fact that God creates the world out of love for a human being. And as the first person that I met when I wrote my book about Pakistan pointed out, if you want to understand what the mystery of Shiism is all about, it's very simple. We're supposed to love God. If you want to love God, how do you express that? By loving those whom God loved. And whom did God love? He loved Habibullah, Hazrat Muhammad. And how do you show love for the Prophet Muhammad? By loving those whom he loved. By loving Ali. By loving Fatima, by loving Hassan, by loving Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This focus on Ali, you might think, well, this is going to be divisive, because the Sunni kids are going to say, why are you doing all this Shia stuff in class? The fact is that the Sunni kids have heard all this stuff from their grandparents and from their uncles. They remember bits and pieces of this. This is not something that divides the Sunni and the Shia. This is something that I have found to be universal in Islam. Look at what people write poetry about. They don't write poetry about, well, I don't mean this, there's very little poetry written about Omar. I'm not saying that to be joking, there's very little poetry written about Uthman. But people write poetry about Ali. One of my favorite, there's a poetic text in Turkish called the Vasiyetnama. Again, I don't know if the story is true, but it's so wonderful. When Ali was born in the Kaaba, he held his blanket over his face, and he would not remove it so no one could see his face, so they finally had to run and get the Prophet Muhammad. And when the Prophet came, Ali pulls it down and smiles because he wanted the first thing he saw in this world to be the face of his beloved Mawla. We see this in the story of Qadir, because there we see the notion of the Prophet saying, if you love me, you love him. There's a wonderful version of this in the Imam Safi Buruk, a text of the Safaviya Sufi order. It's also told by the Alawis in Turkey that when the Sahaba saw this, they said, first he married him to his daughter, then he makes him his Mawla, and out of that jealousy was where the beginning of fitna begins. This jealousy, that instead of recognizing this notion of love, and when we pull this together, we see this manifestation of this mysterious love between the Prophet and Ali manifested in the Sunni tradition throughout the Sufi tradition that permeates all of the Sunni world. Ali was the one who sold himself to God by sleeping in the Prophet's bed on the eve of the Hijrah. And Ali is, of course, the father of Hassan and Hussein, who used to climb on the back of the Prophet when he was saying his prayers. If we want to understand how one loves one's friends and one's family, we need to look at the lives of these people and their interactions with them. Not as a list of rules that tell us, and here's how you do it, but in understanding existentially and emotionally, this is how these people lived and how we should strive to be like this. Thus, I would argue that Ishq and Muhabbat, drawing on this, become crucial concepts throughout the Muslim world in every language. The Layla and Majnun story. By the way, the wonderful Palestinian film Habibi, you should see this film. This story of Layla and Majnun, the idea that Islam is about love and that the lover contains the understanding of what it means to be one who submits to God. I'm running out of time here, just a couple of other things to sort of pull this together. It is in these relationships between God and Ali, between Ali and Fatima, between Zainab and Hussein, that one can see how we are to behave as human beings, because it's where we learn humanity. It's where we learn insaniyat. Fatima's courage before Umar over Faidak, Zainab's courage before Yazid, Imam Hussein's courage at Karbala, Ali's dignity following his murder at Najaf. These are all evidence of what it is to be the perfected human being. As I tell our students who are interested in Arabic and Farsi and Turkish, they do this not only to learn about the lives of others, but also to learn something about themselves. Think about Rumi. There is no doubt that Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi was a Sunni alim. He was Sunni in his fiqh, he was Sunni in his kalam. But when you read his descriptions of Hazrat Ali in the Mafnavi, it's clear that the kind of devotion that he has is the same kind of devotion that we find among the people in Israel. This notion that we pull together, we look at the Sufi tradition, the Sufi orders that do not trace their lineage back directly through Ali, either go through Imam Ali Ridha, or through Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, or through both. There is no way that we can simply remove devotion to the Ahlul Bayt from the world of Islam in general. It's not a matter of privileging some sort of Shi'i worldview about the understanding of the Ahlul Bayt. This love of the Ahlul Bayt has, until very recently, and I would argue it still is beyond very loud voices, been at the center of how Muslims have understood themselves. By focusing on Islam as a tradition of love and humanity, my students are thus drawn to explore rather than reject Islam. I mean, nobody's particularly drawn to the notion of religion as a sense, as a group, as a kind of set of burdensome rules. You know, that's why Jesus looks so much better than the Pharisees in the New Testament, right? Because he's about love. He says you have to obey every tittle iota of the law, but he emphasizes that without love, the law is just a corpse. And so when we pass these traditions on to the students, they then understand that there's something that they as Muslims share with each other, but there's something that Islam has to teach even non-Muslims about the nature of love, the nature of compassion, the nature of devotion, the nature of courage. And I'm going to end with this. I think it is really fascinating that when we look at the people who become extremists, the hyper-partisan Salafis, those who are systematically destroying important monuments, both religious and historical, on the Arabian Peninsula as we speak right now, that these are people who reject devotion to the Ahlul Bayt and even to the Prophet Muhammad and ishq for the Ahlul Bayt and for Muhammad as shirk. So that I would argue that this understanding of these connections of the centrality of devotion to Ali and the Ahlul Bayt, and I do not say this just as a believer. It may sound that way. But I say this also as a scholar. You cannot look at the history of Islam as a religion and not understand that this devotion to the Ahlul Bayt, this devotion to Ali, has been a current in nearly every part of the Muslim world. It's true that, those people who somehow look to Ibn Taymiyyah as their source are trying to say that, no, that's not really Islam. Islam's just about Tawheed. This is all shirk. They try to argue that theirs is the mainstream view of Islam. But historically, it simply is not true. When we actually look historically at Islam, that this devotion to the Ahlul Bayt and this devotion to Hazrat Ali alayhi salam is at the center of most of the most popular positions held by Muslims throughout Islamic history. That's what I try to get forth to my students at Kenyon, and that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.